The winter of 1944–45 was the Götterdämmerung of the Third Reich. The Allied bomber streams, vast constellations of B-17s and Lancasters, scribbled contrails of ruin across the German sky by day and by night. Cities were reduced to phosphorus-lit skeletons. Fuel shortages grounded entire Luftwaffe wings. The once unstoppable Blitzkrieg army was now a broken, retreating force fighting a desperate, bloody rearguard action on two fronts. Time was not a resource, it was an enemy, advancing with the relentless tread of Soviet tank divisions and the drone of American piston engines. In this atmosphere of apocalyptic urgency, where the demand was for simple, mass-producible weapons, Volkssturm rifles, Panzerfausts, and the desperate, explosive-laden piloted aircraft of the Selbstopfer units, a different kind of work continued in places hidden from the rain of bombs. In a camouflaged concrete bunker complex nestled in the Harz Mountains, designated Forschungswerk 13, a small team of engineers and aerodynamicists labored under the aegis of the Sonderentwicklung, Special Development Division. Their leader was Dr. Victor Long, a theoretical physicist turned aircraft designer whose brilliance was matched only by his profound, unspoken disillusionment. The project on his drawing boards was not born of the immediate screaming needs of the front. It was the product of a cold, futuristic logic that saw beyond the war's inevitable end. It was a hedge against a different kind of defeat: technological obsolescence. The Allies had jets, the British Gloster Meteor was in service, the American P-80 Shooting Star was nearing completion. Germany had operational jets too, the Messerschmitt Me-262, a devastatingly fast Predator that could outfly any Allied piston fighter. But the Me-262 was a compromise, a jet engine bolted onto a fundamentally conventional airframe. Dr. Lang's team was pursuing something pure, more radical. Their creation, designated internally as the P-1211 Silverbird, Silberwerk, was not an attempt to win the war that was raging. It was an attempt to define the war that would come next. It was a leap into a future so distant that even as they worked, surrounded by the crumbling reality of the Nazi state, they understood they were building a machine for a world that did not yet exist. The materials they needed, high-temperature alloys, advanced electrical systems, were vanishing from the supply chain. The skilled technicians were being drafted into Volkssturm units. Every day, the gap between their vision and the disintegrating world outside widened. They were not just building a jet, they were building a ghost. The P-1211 defied categorization. It was a product of the 3x1000 philosophy whispered among advanced German designers, an aircraft capable of 1,000 kilometers per hour, carrying a 1,000-kilogram payload with a 1,000-kilometer range. But Lang's team took this further. The Silbervogel was conceived not as a frontline combatant, but as a strategic penetrator. Its mission profile was chilling in its simplicity and ambition: to take off from German soil, ascend to the very edge of the atmosphere, and streak across the Atlantic at speeds that rendered interception a mathematical absurdity, to deliver a single decisive weapon, be it a high-explosive bomb, a chemical agent, or, in the most feverish theoretical planning, a primitive nuclear device, onto the continental United States before gliding back to a friendly base. It was not a fighter. It required no dogfighting capability. It was not a traditional bomber. It carried only one weapon. It was a spear. This singular purpose dictated a form that broke every established rule of aerodynamics. To the engineers steeped in the design language of the Bf-109 or even the sleek Me-262, the Silbervogel looked alien, almost heretical. The aircraft was all wing. It employed a radical delta-wing platform, a vast, triangular lifting surface that provided the necessary area for high-altitude flight while offering minimal drag at hypersonic speeds. There was no distinct fuselage in the conventional sense. The cockpit, engines, and payload were all smoothly blended into the wing's root, creating a flat, arrowhead shape. The tail was virtually non-existent, replaced by small embedded control surfaces at the wingtips. The entire design philosophy was one of laminar flow and area ruling, concepts only dimly understood elsewhere, intended to allow the aircraft to slip through the air with less resistance than a rifle bullet. Its proposed power plant was as radical as its airframe. Initial designs called for a hybrid rocket jet system, a Walter liquid-fueled rocket motor for an explosive climb to altitude, where a revolutionary ramjet, an engine with no moving parts that compresses air through sheer forward velocity,
would ignite and propel the craft to its cruising speed of over Mach 4. This was not incremental improvement, it was a rejection of the entire propulsion paradigm of the era. The Silbervogel was not meant to duel with Mustangs over Berlin. It was designed to fly in a realm where the sky was black, the stars were visible at noon, and the very air molecules offered not just resistance, but the means of propulsion. The theoretical brilliance of the P-1211 was confirmed and then utterly complicated by the wind tunnel tests. Using scaled models in the high-speed tunnels at the secretive Aerodynamic Versuchsanstalt in Göttingen, Long's team began to probe the boundaries of their creation. The initial data was exhilarating. Of simulated speeds above Mach 2.5, the Delta Wing's performance was stellar. Drag coefficients were lower than any theoretical model had predicted. The design was too efficient. Then, as the simulated velocity pushed past Mach 3.5, the data streams began to writhe with instability. The issue was not a simple flutter or buffeting, the classic problems of high-speed flight. It was something more profound. The wind tunnel models, intricately instrumented with strain gauges and pressure sensors, began to report forces that the engineers' equations could not fully describe. At certain angles of attack in this hypersonic regime, the airflow over the wing did not simply separate turbulently, it underwent a phase change. Shock waves, instead of stabilizing along predictable lines, would interact with the boundary layer in chaotic, resonant patterns, creating pockets of wildly fluctuating pressure. These weren't mere bumps in the air, they were aerodynamic earthquakes. The consequence was a terrifying form of control inversion. The aircraft's embedded elevons, designed to provide pitch and roll control, would become useless. In these resonant zones, deflecting a control surface didn't produce the opposite aerodynamic force, it could amplify the instability. The pilot's inputs would not just be ineffective, but catastrophic. The engineers dubbed these zones Teufelswände, devil's windows, regimes of speed and altitude where the laws of physics, as they understood them, seemed to rewrite themselves in real time. The jet wasn't unsafe due to poor welding, weak materials, or faulty hydraulics. Its peril was fundamental. It was aerodynamically clairvoyant, operating in a flight envelope where the science of control had not yet been invented. The pilots of 1945, no matter how skilled, were biological processors operating at human speed. To navigate the Teufelswände would require a pilot with the reaction time of a computer, capable of making micro-corrections thousands of times a second, predicting the unpredictable. The machine had outrun the capability of its intended master. The control systems of the era were cables, pulleys, hydraulic boosters, like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. As head test pilot Flugkapitän Eric Braun reviewed the data with Long, he reportedly said, his voice flat with awe and fear, "Herr Doctor, this aircraft does not want a pilot, it wants a philosopher or a god." The P-1211 was not a flawed machine, it was a perfect machine for a future that lacked the infrastructure to support it. A future without digital fly-by-wire computers, without advanced composite materials to handle the thermal loads, without the computational fluid dynamics to map its Teufelswände. It was a key for which no lock yet existed, and in the collapsing chaos of 1945, that made it not a weapon, but a secret too dangerous to exist.
The order came down not through the usual Luftwaffe channels, but as a whispered directive from the very top of the crumbling SS research apparatus. Time had run out. The Red Army was a thunderstorm rolling in from the east. The Western Allies were a vice closing from the west. The Silbervogel was no longer a project for the future. It was now a token, a final, desperate card to be played in a last-ditch bargaining strategy, or a terrible weapon to be unleashed in a final act of vengeance. It had to fly. Not as a model, not in a tunnel, but in the cold, hard reality of the Bavarian sky. The pilot selected was Oberleutnant Hans von Ritter, a man whose reputation was built not on flamboyant kills, but on a preternatural calm and a technical intellect that bordered on the obsessive. He had flown the Me-163 Comet, the rocket-powered death trap, and survived. He had tested early models of the Me-262, pushing them beyond their red lines. In the eyes of Dr. Lang, Ritter possessed the two qualities essential for this mission, the nerves of a surgeon and the analytical mind of an engineer. He was briefed in a damp underground bunker lit by a single swaying bulb. Present were Lang, a grim-faced SS Standartenführer, and no one else. There were no maps, no detailed technical manuals. Instead, Lang spread out hand-drawn graphs showing the Teufelsfenster, the Devil's Windows, the zones of speed and altitude where the aircraft's controls would become not just unresponsive, but treacherously inverted. "You must not enter these corridors, Hans," Lang said, his finger tracing the shaded areas on the plot. "The data is theoretical, but the danger is absolute. The machine, in these conditions, it will not obey you." The SS officer's instructions were simpler, colder. "Your primary mission is to prove the aircraft's capabilities. Your secondary mission is to ensure it does not fall into enemy hands. If you cannot maintain control, if you are damaged, if you are forced down behind enemy lines, you know what to do." He did not need to mention the self-destruct charge nor the Walther P-38 pistol placed in the cockpit alongside the flight manuals. The final order was stark. Do not attempt to land near populated areas. The fuel, the explosives, make your end a fire in an empty field. The morning of the flight, April 10, 1945, dawned with a brittle, clear cold. The Silbervogel sat on a reinforced concrete strip at a secluded airfield near Lechfeld, its radical delta shape looking less like an aircraft and more like a discarded shard of some futuristic architecture. It was painted a dull, non-reflective gray and bore no markings, no swastika, no squadron insignia, no identification number. It was a ghost before it ever flew. The hybrid engine start was a sequence of violence and beauty. First, the Walter HWK-509A rocket motor ignited with a searing, white-hot shriek, a sound that tore the morning apart. The Silbervogel shot down the runway, accelerating with a force that pressed Ritter back into his seat with a brutality no piston or turbojet could match. In seconds, he was airborne, the rocket burning ferociously, climbing at an angle so steep it seemed the aircraft was aiming for the stars themselves. At 12,000 meters, as planned, the rocket fuel was exhausted. For a heart-stopping moment, there was silence, a weightless coast. Then, as the aircraft's velocity bled through the thin air, the ramjet intakes finally found their design pressure. With a deep, resonant whump that Ritter felt in his bones, the ramjet ignited. This was not the roar of a jet, it was the sound of the sky itself being torn open. The acceleration returned, smoother now, immense and relentless. The performance projections, born from wind tunnels and slide rules, were immediately rendered obsolete. The climb rate was steeper, the speed built faster. The aircraft was not just meeting its design goals, it was consuming them. Ritter watched the landscape of southern Germany shrink into a miniature topological map, the Alps becoming mere wrinkles on a blanket of cloud. He was leaving not just the ground, but the very concept of aviation as the world knew it. As the Silbervogel pierced the stratosphere, the first signs of the predicted and unpredicted problems began. It started with the instruments. The pitot tube, designed to measure airspeed, was suddenly feeding nonsense data to the dials. At these velocities and altitudes, the air was less a fluid and more a scattered plasma. The standard principles of air pressure measurement broke down. The airspeed indicator needle swung wildly, then settled on a number that Ritter, cross-referencing with his engine gauges and the vanishing landscape, knew was impossibly low. The altimeter, a barometric instrument, froze. The thinning atmosphere provided no reliable pressure differential to measure. One by one, the gauges blinked out or lied. The gyroscopic artificial horizon began to tumble, confused by the radical trajectory and the faint but strange gravitational effects at the edge of its performance envelope. The temperature gauge for the leading wing edges, a critical measure, pegged at its maximum, and then its needle fell limp, the sensor likely vaporized. He was flying a machine of the future using instruments of the past. He was blind in a cathedral of speed. Worse than the failing gauges was the feedback, or lack thereof, through the controls. The control column, linked to the elevons by a heavy-duty hydraulic system, began to feel strange. At first, it was a slight mushiness, a delay between input and response. Then, as he nudged the stick to correct a minor yaw, the response was not just delayed, but opposite. The aircraft dipped a wing in the direction contrary to his command.
A cold sweat broke through his flight suit. He was entering a Teufelsfenster. The aircraft was now a living entity, reacting to aerodynamic laws not in the manuals. It flew on the edge of a physics that was only theoretical. Every minor correction required a counterintuitive, nerve-wracking calculation. To climb, he had to think about managing energy and angle in a way that felt like a descent. To turn, he had to anticipate a roll that would not manifest for several seconds, and then would threaten to over-rotate. He was not so much flying as negotiating, bargaining with a force of nature he could not see or measure. Later, in the debriefing shack after the flight, his hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and cold, he would struggle to find the words. It was not like piloting. It was like riding a lightning bolt. The machine did not feel like it was moving through the air. It felt as if it was tearing a hole in the sky, and the sky was fighting back. The instruments were meaningless. You had to feel it in your stomach, in your spine. It was trying to go faster than the numbers could count, higher than the gaugers could measure. Herr Doctor, it felt like the aircraft was trying to outrun reality itself. Hans Ritter's flight was a staggering technical success and a simultaneous damning operational indictment. He had landed, miraculously, after a harrowing descent where he had to essentially relearn how to fly the aircraft in the thicker lower atmosphere, treating it like an entirely different machine. He brought back data that was both exhilarating and fatal to the project. The Silbervogel worked. It was faster, could fly higher, and was more radical than anyone had dared hope. And it was utterly useless to the Third Reich. The reasons were a cascade of logistical impossibilities. First, it required rare alloys Germany no longer had. The skin of the aircraft, subjected to temperatures well over 500 degrees Celsius from atmospheric friction at hypersonic speeds, needed advanced titanium and nickel steel composites. Germany's access to the necessary raw materials and the specialized forges to work them had been severed by bombing and lost territory. The prototype existed only because those materials had been hoarded like gold dust for years. Producing even a dozen such aircraft was a fantasy. Second, it demanded pilots trained beyond existing doctrine. Ritter was a singular talent, training a squadron of pilots to handle the Teufelsfenster, to fly by instinct when instruments failed, to understand the hybrid rocket ramjet propulsion with its tiny, precise launch window. This was not a matter of months. It was a generational shift in pilot education. The Luftwaffe in 1945 was scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel, sending up teenagers with a few hours in gliders. The Silbervogel required astronaut-level aptitude in a nation that could barely keep its basic fighters in the air.
Third, it needed runways longer than any still intact. The rocket-assisted takeoff demanded an immense, perfectly straight, reinforced concrete strip free of bomb craters. By April 1945, every major airfield in Germany was a cratered moonscape, relentlessly pounded by Allied air power. The hidden strip at Lechfeld used for the test was one of the last of its kind, and it was already being targeted. There was nowhere left from which to launch a fleet of such aircraft. But the most compelling reason for shelving the Silbervogel was one of terrifying prudence. If it crashed into enemy hands, it would reveal the future of aviation. A single captured airframe, even a wreck, would provide the Allies, the Americans with their intact industrial base and vast resources, with a 5-year, perhaps a 10-year leap in aerospace technology. The delta wing, the ramjet concept, the understanding of hypersonic flight dynamics, all of it would be laid bare. In the hands of the Reich, it was a magnificent, useless relic. In the hands of the enemy, it was a blueprint for global air dominance in the coming decades. The decision was made at the highest level of the crumbling regime. The Silbervogel was not to be destroyed, not immediately. It was too valuable as a bargaining chip in potential clandestine surrender negotiations with the West. But it was to be hidden. The prototype was disassembled with meticulous care. Its components, the revolutionary Walter rocket, the ramjet core, the delta wing spar, were crated not as aircraft parts, but as industrial machine tools or medical equipment. These crates were dispersed, some going to underground facilities in the Harz Mountains, others reportedly loaded onto U-boats in the final desperate days of the war, destined for locations as disparate as Argentina and Antarctica.
The blueprints and wind tunnel data were microfilmed and scattered. The Silbervogel was erased, not from history, but from the immediate grasp of the present. Germany had built a bridge to the next century and then, with a trembling hand, burned its end of it, lest the enemy follow them across. The order did not come via a standard military telex. It was delivered by a black Mercedes that slithered through the pine forests surrounding Forschungswerk 13 in the dead of night, 3 days after Ritter's flight. The man who emerged was not in uniform, but wore the severe black suit of a high-ranking Reichssicherheitshauptamt, Reich Main Security Office functionary. He carried a single sealed envelope bearing the eagle and swastika and the ominous title, Chef der Sicherheitspolizei und des SD. It was signed by Kaltenbrunner himself. Dr. Victor Lange was summoned from his cot, where he had been attempting to reconcile the flight data with his turbulent dreams. In the bare concrete office, under the stark light of a single bulb, the functionary did not sit. He handed Lange the envelope. The decision has been made. The Sonderprojekt P1211 is to be terminated, completely, permanently. You will supervise. The wording was bureaucratic, but its meaning was absolute. Destroy all prototypes. There was only the one flying prototype, but also several structural test frames and a wind tunnel model of exquisite detail. Burn the documents, every calculation, every stress analysis, every flutter test result from the first napkin sketch to the final post-flight debrief. Bury the remains. Leave no fragment larger than a hand's breadth. Lange protested, his voice a dry rasp. The data, the achievement, this is the future of flight. The future, Herr Doctor, is a luxury the Reich can no longer afford. The present demands discretion. If the enemy finds even a rivet from this project, they will reverse engineer a decade in a year. You have until dawn to begin. My men will assist. The assistance came in the form of a squad of SS Pioneers, combat engineers with explosives and cutting torches, and a detail from the Verbrennungskommando, the burning detachment responsible for destroying sensitive material. That night, Forschungswerk 13 became a scene of controlled, fanatical obliteration. The process was methodical and heartbreaking. The beautiful gray Silbervogel prototype was not merely scrapped, it was unmade. Technicians, under the watchful eyes of the SS, first drained its fuel and removed the volatile rocket chemicals. Then, with oxyacetylene torches that cast dancing, demonic shadows on the hangar walls, they began to cut. They did not follow seam lines. They carved the aircraft into grotesque geometric chunks. The sleek, revolutionary delta wing was bisected, then quartered, the spars screaming as they were severed. The blended fuselage was hacked apart. The cockpit where Ritter had wrestled with the Teufelfenster was crushed under the deliberate blow of a sledgehammer. The engine was given special attention. The Walter rocket motor and the intricate ramjet core were separated. The rocket motor was taken to a heavy forge on site, heated until its special alloys glowed, and then crushed flat under a hydraulic press. The ramjet, a masterpiece of aerodynamic interior design, was filled with a mixture of thermite and high explosive. Its detonation at the bottom of a nearby quarry was a muffled, ground-shaking thud that sent a column of sickly orange fire into the pre-dawn sky. The documentation was fed to a more insatiable fire. Piles of paper, reams of differential equations, wind tunnel plots on translucent Leispapier, photographs of the model in the Göttingen tunnel, Ritter's handwritten flight notes, were tossed into roaring incinerators. The heat was so intense it warped the metal siding of the shed housing them. Microfilm canisters were smashed, their contents unspooled and burned. The work was so thorough that they destroyed not only the originals, but the typewriter ribbons that had made the copies and the notebooks of the secretaries who had typed them. As the first gray light of April 14th touched the Harz Mountains, trucks laden with the mangled remains of the Silbervogel rumbled towards a played-out iron mine, the shocked Conrad. Under the gaze of armed guards, the pieces were unceremoniously dumped down the main shaft, followed by several tons of rubble and mine tailings to ensure they were buried under hundreds of feet of rock in ruin. The final act was the rewriting of the official records. Luftwaffe inventory logs were retrospectively edited, showing the materials used for the Forschungswerk 13 as having been allocated to bridge repair and submarine battery research. Personnel rosters were altered, names of key engineers were reassigned to other vaporized projects. The Silbervogel was erased, not from history, but from the immediate grasp of the present. Germany had built a bridge to the next century and then, with a trembling hand, burned its end of it, lest the enemy follow them across.
In May 1945, the forward elements of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, advancing through the forested labyrinth of central Germany, secured the Harz region. Guided by tips from liberated forced laborers and German anti-Nazis, they began to uncover the regime's hidden technological treasures. The subterranean factory of Mittelwerk Dora, where V-2 rockets were built, the secret aircraft factories buried in mountainsides. Operation Paperclip, the race to capture German scientists and technology, was in full swing. Teams of technical intelligence officers, men from the U.S. Army's Field Information Agency, Technical, FIA, and the British Air Ministry's intelligence branch, descended on Forschungswerk 13. What they found was profoundly frustrating. The hangars were empty, swept clean. The workshops held only standard, nondescript machine tools. The offices contained innocuous paperwork related to agricultural machinery and engine parts. It was all too clean, too neat. Yet clues remained, invisible to the untrained eye but glaring to the experts. Captain John Jack Harper, a former MIT aeronautical engineer turned intelligence officer, paced the main hangar floor. He noted the unusually heavy electrical conduits feeding into the building, capacity far beyond needs for lighting or simple tools. He found scorch marks on the concrete in a specific, concentrated pattern, along with stubborn chemical stains that wouldn't scrub away, residue from exotic rocket fuels and high-temperature alloys. In a drainage culvert, one of his sergeants found a single twisted piece of metal no larger than a finger. It was lightweight, incredibly hard, and showed signs of having been subjected to intense, localized heat. It was a fragment of a turbine blade or combustion chamber, but of a design and material Harper couldn't immediately identify. Most tellingly, the local German staff, the caretakers, the cooks, the few low-level technicians left behind, were uniformly, nervously uninformative. They had seen nothing, but their eyes flickered towards the sealed mine shaft, Schacht Conrad, which had been recently and heavily obstructed with fresh rubble. Harper's team lacked the heavy equipment to clear it quickly, and by the time they could requisition it, priorities had shifted to more immediately fruitful captures, like the intact team of Werner von Braun at Peenemünde. The intelligence reports filed from Forschungswerk 13 were circumspect. They noted evidence of high-priority advanced aerospace research, systematic destruction of materials, and probable removal or burial of prototypes. But without a blueprint, a witness, or a piece of hardware bigger than a paperweight, they had no proof. The Silbervogel became a ghost in the Allied intelligence catalog, a footnote in a report on German secret weapons, unconfirmed references to a high-speed, long-range aircraft project, possibly rocket-powered. No substantiating evidence recovered. The greatest aerodynamic leap of the war had vanished into the German earth just weeks before the hands that could have seized it, understood it, and propagated its genius reached the spot. The story lay dormant for a generation, buried as deeply as the Silbervogel's bones. The world moved on, through the straight-winged jets of Korea to the sleek supersonic fighters of the Cold War. The F-104 Starfighter, with its razor-thin wings, echoed a desperate need for speed. The X-15 rocket plane kissed the edge of space. The theories of hypersonic flight and atmospheric re-entry became the new frontier. Then, in the early 1970s, Dr. Emily Stanton, an aerospace historian at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, was conducting a routine literature review. She was tracing the intellectual lineage of the area rule, the foundational concept, discovered in the 1950s, that a fuselage should be pinched at the wings to reduce drag at transonic speeds. She was examining declassified German research from the 1940s, boxes of captured but poorly indexed documents that had gathered dust for decades.
In a folder marked Aerodynamic Diverse Theorien, 1944, she found a water-stained bound notebook. The cover bore only the initials VL. The pages were filled with dense, precise Gothic script and elegant hand-drawn graphs. One diagram stopped her cold. It was a plotted curve showing drag coefficient against Mach number for a Pfeilflügelkörperkonfiguration, aero wing body configuration. The curve was startling. It predicted a dramatic drag reduction at Mach 2.8, followed by a stable plateau, exactly the performance characteristic that modern computer models for delta-wing aircraft, like the proposed Anglo-French Concorde supercruiser, were only now, in the 1970s, fully verifying. The date scribbled in the corner of the page was October 1944. Stanton's heart hammered against her ribs. She dug deeper. She found stress analysis for a home-free Tragflyer, sparless wing, using a bonded sandwich composite structure, a concept not operational until the 1960s. She found calculations for ramjet ignition thresholds at specific dynamic pressures, calculations that matched those in her own contemporary propulsion textbooks. Here, in fading ink on cheap wartime paper, were the solutions to problems her colleagues were still grinding through on room-sized computers. The dates didn't align. Germany had reached those conclusions 30 years too early. Stanton's subsequent paper, published in the niche Journal of Aeronautical History, sent a quiet shockwave through the small world of aerospace historiography. Other researchers began combing through the archival haystacks. A battered wind tunnel data log from Göttingen, long misfiled, was found. It contained pressure distribution maps for a pure delta wing at Mach 4, data that was eerily predictive of the flight behavior of the American SR-71 Blackbird, then the most advanced aircraft in the world and still deeply classified. A former German technician, now an old man living in Canada, gave an interview where he vaguely recalled a phantom Flugzeug, a phantom aircraft, that was all-wing and made no sound like other jets. Piece by piece, a silhouette emerged from the fog of war and time. It was not the recovery of a machine, but the resurrection of an idea. The Silbervogel's legacy was not in steel and aluminum, but in lines on a graph, in solutions to equations that had taken the rest of the world decades to rederive. The victorious Allies had won the war, but in this one arcane field of applied physics, they had spent the better part of the Cold War catching up to a ghost.